It took me years to understand that the problem was never me. For most of my life, I carried this weight, this feeling that something about me was fundamentally wrong, that if I could just figure out what it was, if I could just fix that broken part, everything would finally make sense. My family would finally see me, finally accept me. I was 28 years old, sitting alone in my apartment on a Tuesday night, when I realized the truth. They didn't want me fixed. They wanted me silent. They called me dramatic, overly sensitive, the one who made things difficult. But the truth? I was just the only one who refused to pretend. And in a family built on pretending, that made me dangerous. I remember being 7 years old, sitting at the breakfast table. My mother was talking about my brother's science fair project, how brilliant it was, how proud she was. My father nodded along, smiling. I had won second place in the district writing competition the week before. I'd been so excited to tell them. "Mom," I said quietly, "did you see my certificate? It's on the fridge." She glanced at me, and for just a second, less than a second, her face did something I couldn't name then. Now, I'd call it irritation. Like I'd interrupted something important with something trivial. "That's nice, sweetie," she said, turning back to my brother. "Now, tell your father about the hypothesis part again." It was such a small thing, so small that when I tried to explain it years later to a friend, I felt stupid. She said, "That's nice," my friend pointed out. "That's not mean." No, it wasn't mean. It was something else entirely. It was the tone, the way her eyes didn't quite reach mine, the way she said nice like someone commenting on the weather, polite, empty, already moving on to what actually mattered. That was the pattern, not cruelty, never cruelty, just absence, a careful, calculated absence of the thing I needed most. When I was 10, my grandmother died. At the funeral, I cried. Not loudly, I've never been loud, but I cried, and my aunt pulled me aside afterward. "Your mother's being so strong through all this," she whispered, squeezing my shoulder. "You should try to be strong for her too." I was 10. My grandmother had died, but somehow, my grief was making things harder for my mother. I learned to cry in the bathroom with the water running. Middle school was worse. That's when I started asking questions. Not rebellious questions, just real ones. "Why don't we ever talk about Grandpa's drinking?" The table went silent. My mother's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. My father's face hardened in that particular way that meant I'd crossed a line I couldn't see. "We don't talk about that," my mother said finally, her voice tight, "because there's nothing to talk about." But there was. Everyone knew there was. Grandpa had been drunk at Christmas, drunk at Easter, drunk at my brother's graduation. Everyone saw it. Everyone knew. But I was the only one who said it out loud. That night, I heard them talking in the kitchen. The words were muffled, but the tone was clear. "He's going to embarrass us one day. He doesn't know when to just leave things alone. I don't know where he gets it from." I was 12 years old, lying in bed, listening to my parents discuss me like I was a problem to be managed. High school brought a different flavor of the same thing. My brother was the athlete, popular, easy. He knew how to be what people wanted. I didn't have that skill, or maybe I did, and I just couldn't make myself use it. I joined the debate team. I was good at it. Really good. We made it to state championships my junior year. My parents came to one tournament, won in 3 years, and left at lunch because my father had a work thing. "We're proud of you," my mother said on the phone that night. "You know that?" "But I didn't know that." Because proud parents don't leave. Proud parents don't forget to ask about the outcome. Proud parents don't compare you unfavorably to your brother at every family gathering. Your brother never needed all this attention, my aunt said once at Thanksgiving. She said it like it was a joke, but everyone laughed except me. I didn't need attention. I needed to be seen. There's a difference. There's a specific kind of silence that exists in families like mine. It's not the peaceful kind. It's heavy, tactical. It's the silence that falls when you walk into a room and realize they were just talking about you. It's the silence after you share good news and no one knows how to respond without making it about themselves. It's the silence that teaches you to stop sharing. By the time I was 17, I'd learned the rules. Don't ask questions that make people uncomfortable. Don't bring up things that are in the past. Don't have feelings that inconvenience others. Don't need support when it's not convenient to give. Don't exist too loudly in spaces that aren't meant for you. I didn't think of it that way then. I just thought I was difficult, hard to love, too much. College was supposed to be different, a fresh start. But you can't outrun the person you've been taught to be. I called home every week that first semester. My mother answered maybe half the time. When she did, the conversations were surface level. How were classes? Was I eating enough? The weather there must be different. She never asked how I was. Not really. Not in the way that invites a real answer. My brother, who went to school 2 hours away, had dinner with them every other weekend. I heard about it through his Instagram stories. When I mentioned it, casually, carefully, my mother sighed. "You're so far away, honey. It's not the same." I was 3 hours away. He was 2. 60 minutes of difference. But in those 60 minutes lived the truth. He was worth the drive. I wasn't. Senior year, I met someone. Her name was Rachel. She was the first person who made me feel like I wasn't the problem. We'd talk for hours about everything: family, dreams, all the small violences that no one else seemed to notice. "Your family sounds exhausting," she said once, not unkindly. "They're not bad people," I said automatically. It was reflex. I'd spent my whole life defending them. "I didn't say they were bad," Rachel replied. "I said they sound exhausting. There's a difference." I brought her home for Christmas. I was nervous, desperately nervous, because I wanted them to see what I saw in her. I wanted them to see that I was capable of being loved. My mother was polite, gracious even. She asked Rachel about school, her family, her plans, all the right questions. But after dinner, when Rachel went to the bathroom, my mother leaned across the table. "She seems intense," she said, her voice careful. "What does that mean?" I asked. "Just that she has a lot of opinions. Strong ones." I felt it then, that old familiar feeling, the sense that I'd done something wrong without knowing what it was. "She's passionate," I said quietly. "I like that about her." My mother smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, I'm just saying." Rachel and I broke up 6 months later. For different reasons, unrelated reasons. But sometimes I wonder what would have happened if my family had welcomed her. If they'd seen her as a person I loved, instead of another example of me being different. After graduation, I moved to a city 4 hours away, got a job, built a life. I called less, visited less. It was easier that way. But every family gathering I did attend followed the same script. My brother would talk about his job, his girlfriend, his new car. Everyone would lean in, engaged, asking questions. I'd share something about my work, and the conversation would drift. My mother would mention how she wished I lived closer. My father would make a comment about how I'd finally settled down, meaning stopped being difficult, and I'd smile and nod and feel that familiar ache, the one that told me I was still 7 years old, holding up a certificate no one wanted to see. Every family needs someone to carry what no one wants to admit. That's what I was. The repository for all the dysfunction they couldn't acknowledge. The scapegoat. I didn't have that word for it until I was 26 and stumbled across an article about family dynamics. I was supposed to be working, but I couldn't stop reading. Scapegoat. Family systems theory. Identified patient. Suddenly, everything made sense. The scapegoat isn't the problem child. They're the truth teller, the one who points out that the emperor has no clothes. And for that, they're punished. Not with obvious cruelty, but with something more insidious. Emotional exile. You become the reason for every tension, every uncomfortable moment, every family fight. Not because you cause them, but because you refuse to pretend they don't exist. I thought about all those times I'd asked innocent questions. Why don't we ever talk about why Aunt Linda stopped coming to holidays? Why did you and Dad stop sleeping in the same room? Why do you treat my brother differently than you treat me? Every question was met with the same response. You're making things difficult. You're stirring up drama. Why can't you just let things be? But I wasn't stirring anything up. The drama was already there. I was just refusing to look away from it. And that refusal to participate in the collective delusion, was my unforgivable sin. It happened on a random Saturday in October. I was 28, and my mother had invited me to dinner. Just family, she'd said. It's been too long. I almost said no. I'd learned by then that just family dinners were rarely simple. But something in me, that stubborn, hopeful part that still wanted to belong, said yes. My brother was there with his fiancée, Emma. My parents. My father's sister and her husband. The table was set beautifully. My mother had made pot roast, my father's favorite. Everything seemed normal at first. Easy conversation, laughter. I let myself relax. Then my father started talking about the wedding, my brother's wedding. How proud he was. How he'd always known my brother would find the right person and settle down properly. Not like some people, my aunt said, glancing at me with a smile that was supposed to soften the comment. Everyone laughed. That casual, dismissive laughter that says, "We're joking, but we're not really joking." I felt it rising in me then. That old, familiar thing. The need to defend myself. The need to explain that I wasn't defective, just different. But I was tired. So tired of defending, of explaining, of trying to convince people who didn't want to be convinced. So instead, I said something true. "You know, it's interesting," I said, keeping my voice calm. "I've noticed that whenever we're all together, there's this pattern. We talk about some people's lives like they matter, and other people's lives like they're optional. Amusing, maybe, but not important." The table went quiet. My mother's face did something I'd seen before but never named. Her eyes widened slightly. Her mouth tightened. It was fear and fury mixed together. Fear that I'd broken a rule. Fury that I'd done it in front of others. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice thin. "I'm talking about the fact that you asked me about work for 30 seconds before changing the subject to my brother's wedding. I'm talking about how you introduce him as our successful son, and me as our other son. I'm talking about 28 years of feeling like I'm tolerated, not wanted." My father set down his fork carefully. Too carefully. "This is not the time or place," he said quietly. "When is the time?" I asked. "Because I've tried bringing this up privately, and you both shut me down. I've tried letting it go, and it doesn't go. So when exactly am I allowed to acknowledge that this family has never made space for me?" My brother shifted uncomfortably. Emma stared at her plate. My aunt looked at my mother with an expression that said, "I told you he was difficult." But I kept going. Because I'd started, and stopping would mean another 20 years of silence. "I'm not trying to ruin dinner," I said. "I'm trying to have an honest conversation about something that's been true for as long as I can remember. And the fact that saying this out loud feels like ruining dinner is exactly the problem." My mother's face had gone white, completely white. She stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I need to check on dessert," she said, her voice shaking. She walked into the kitchen. My father watched her go, then looked at me with something I'd never seen before. Not anger, something colder. "You've upset your mother," he said simply. Then he stood, walked to the front door, and locked it. Then the back door. Then the door to the garage. I heard each lock click into place. No one said anything. My brother looked at his plate. Emma looked at my brother. My aunt whispered something to her husband. And I sat there, understanding perfectly what had just happened. I'd told the truth. And for that, I was being locked in until I apologized for it. My father came back to the table, sat down, picked up his fork. "We're going to finish this meal like a normal family," he said, his voice eerily calm. "And then we're going to pretend this conversation never happened." I looked around the table, at these people who shared my blood, my history, my last name. And I realized they didn't want to hear me. They wanted to silence me, not because I was wrong, but because I was right. That's when I understood. Not in a dramatic, climactic way, more like a curtain being pulled back to reveal what had always been there. This family didn't function on love. It functioned on compliance. My brother was loved because he complied. He played the role they'd written for him. Star athlete, good son, safe choice. He never asked difficult questions, never pointed out contradictions, never demanded that they acknowledge the uncomfortable truths hiding beneath the surface. I was tolerated, barely, because I shared their DNA. But I'd never been loved. Not really. Because love, in this family, required self-betrayal. To be accepted here, I had to stop being myself. I had to pretend I didn't see what I saw, feel what I felt, know what I knew. I had to become smaller, quieter, less. And I'd spent 28 years trying to do exactly that, trying to shrink myself down to a size they could tolerate. But I was done. I looked at my father and said, very calmly, "I need to leave." "We're not finished eating," he replied. "I am." I stood up, walked to the front door. My father had locked it with the deadbolt and the chain. "Dad," I said, turning back, "unlock the door." "Sit down," he said. "Stop being dramatic." "I'm not being dramatic. I'm leaving. Unlock the door." We stared at each other. The whole table watched. Finally, my mother emerged from the kitchen. "Let him go," she said quietly. "He's already ruined everything." My father unlocked the door. I walked out into the October night, got in my car, and drove away. And I knew with absolute certainty that I would never sit at that table again. The weeks after were strange, quiet. No one called, no one texted. It was like I'd ceased to exist. My brother finally reached out 3 weeks later. A short message. "Mom's really hurt. You should apologize." I read it sitting in my car outside the grocery store. Read it 3 times. And then I blocked his number. Not out of anger, out of clarity. Because that message confirmed what I'd always suspected. In their version of the story, I was the villain. I was the one who'd hurt people. I was the one who needed to apologize for what? Telling the truth? Refusing to pretend? For the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilty about that. People talk about no contact like it's this big, dramatic decision. A door slamming, a bridge burning. But for me, it was more like stopping. I stopped calling. I stopped showing up. I stopped pretending. And when I stopped, so did they. They didn't reach out, didn't ask why, didn't fight for me. And that told me everything. If your family only wants you around when you're performing the role they've assigned, they don't actually want you. They want a prop. The loneliness was intense at first. Not because I missed them, not in the way you'd think, but because I missed the fantasy. The hope that one day they'd see me. Really see me. And finally, everything would click into place. Letting go of that fantasy felt like grief. I'd spent my entire life waiting for a moment that was never coming. A moment where my mother would hug me and say, "I'm sorry we made you feel invisible." A moment where my father would admit he'd been harder on me than my brother. A moment where someone, anyone, would acknowledge that I'd been carrying something heavy that wasn't mine to carry. But that moment required them to see themselves clearly. And people who build their identities on pretending can't afford to do that. So I grieved. Not for the family I'd lost, but for the family I'd never actually had. I started therapy around this time. My therapist was a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and a very direct manner. "You keep saying, maybe I was too sensitive," she observed during one session. "Why?" "Because that's what they always said. That I took things too personally, made mountains out of molehills." "Did you?" she asked. "Or did you have a normal reaction to abnormal treatment?" I thought about that for a long time. A normal reaction to abnormal treatment. What if the problem wasn't my sensitivity? What if it was their cruelty? The quiet, plausibly deniable kind that leaves no marks but shapes everything. What if I'd spent 28 years apologizing for having feelings in a family that didn't want to acknowledge feelings existed? "They made me believe," I said slowly, "that wanting to be loved was the same thing as being needy." My therapist nodded. "That's what happens when your family operates on scarcity. Love becomes a limited resource, and the person asking for it becomes the problem." I cried that day, really cried. The kind of crying that feels like something breaking open inside you. Because she was right. In my family, love was conditional, scarce. Something you had to earn by being the right kind of person. Easy, uncomplicated, unthreatening. And I'd never been that person. I'd asked too many questions, felt too many things, needed too much reassurance. Not because I was broken, but because I was human. Months passed, then a year. I built a life, a real one. I made friends who didn't require me to perform, who liked me messy and complicated and real. I dated someone who, when I told her about my family, didn't say, "But they're your family," or "Maybe you should give them another chance." She just said, "That sounds really hard. I'm sorry you went through that." I found work I cared about, hobbies I enjoyed, quiet mornings with coffee and no one to perform for. And slowly, so slowly I almost didn't notice, I started to feel lighter. Like I'd been carrying a weight for so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand upright. People warned me I'd regret cutting them off, that I'd miss them. That family was family, and you had to forgive. But I didn't regret it, and I didn't miss them. What I missed was the fantasy, the hope, the dream of what they could have been if they'd chosen differently. But the actual people, the ones who locked doors to trap me in uncomfortable conversations, the ones who made me feel small and wrong and too much? No, I didn't miss them at all. I think that's what people don't understand about estrangement. They assume it's about anger, grudges, punishment. But for me, it was about survival. I couldn't keep lighting myself on fire to keep them warm. I couldn't keep shrinking to fit into spaces that were never designed for me. I had to choose myself. And choosing myself meant letting them go. Not with hatred, not with resentment, just with acceptance. They were who they were, and I was who I was, and those two things were fundamentally incompatible. My brother got married. I didn't go. He didn't invite me. My mother sent a single text a week before the wedding. It would mean a lot to your brother if you came. Not to me, to my brother. Even then, even after everything, she couldn't just say she wanted me there. She had to make it about someone else. I didn't respond. I heard through distant relatives that the wedding was beautiful, that my mother cried during the ceremony, that my father gave a speech about family and legacy, and always being there for your children. I wondered if the irony occurred to any of them, but probably not. People who rewrite history don't notice the contradictions. 2 years after that dinner, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer. It was my father. "Your mother's in the hospital," he said without preamble. "She had a heart attack. She's stable, but you should know." Something in my chest tightened. Not guilt, not exactly. More like old programming kicking in. "Is she going to be okay?" I asked. "They think so. The doctors are optimistic." Silence. Then, "She keeps asking for you." I closed my eyes. "No, she doesn't." "Excuse me?" "She's not asking for me," I said quietly. "She's asking for the version of me that doesn't exist. The one who pretends everything was fine. The one who comes running when called, no matter how badly I've been treated." "Your mother is in the hospital," my father said, his voice hard. "And you're being selfish." "I'm being honest," I replied. "And that's always been my biggest crime in this family." I hung up, and I didn't go to the hospital. People judge me for that. When I tell the story, on the rare occasions I do, there's always someone who looks at me like I'm a monster. "But she could have died," they say. Yes, she could have. And if she had, I would have grieved. Not for the mother she'd been, the distant, conditional, frequently hurtful woman who'd made me feel like an inconvenience for 28 years, but for the mother she could have been if she'd made different choices. But I wouldn't have regretted not going, because going would have required me to betray myself one more time. And I was done betraying myself for people who'd never once protected me. My mother recovered, fully from what I understand. She never called me herself, never sent a message, never acknowledged that maybe the problem in our relationship wasn't just me. And that was its own answer, wasn't it? If her near-death experience didn't make her reach out with honesty and vulnerability, nothing would. Some people aren't capable of the kind of self-reflection required for repair. They'd rather maintain the narrative, even a painful one, than admit they were wrong. And I had to accept that. I'm 33 now, 5 years removed from that October dinner. I've built a good life. Not a perfect one. No one's is. But a real one. An honest one. I have people in my life who see me. Really see me. Not the easy parts or the palatable parts, but all of it. The complicated, messy, too much parts. and they don't run. I've learned that found family is valid family. That blood doesn't obligate you to set yourself on fire. That walking away from toxicity isn't giving up. It's growing up. I still have hard days. Days when I wonder if I'm the villain in their story. Days when I question whether I was too harsh, too unforgiving, too unwilling to compromise. But then I remember. I remember being 7 and holding up a certificate no one wanted to see. I remember being 12 and hearing them discuss me like a problem to be solved. I remember being 17 and learning that my feelings were inconvenient. I remember being 28 and watching my father lock doors to keep me trapped in my discomfort. And I remember that you can't compromise with people who require your silence as the price of admission. Some families don't want children. They want mirrors. They want people who reflect back the image they have of themselves. Good, functional, normal. People who confirm the story they're telling about who they are. And when you refuse to be that mirror, when you insist on being a person with your own thoughts and feelings and needs, you become the problem. Not because you're broken, but because you're real. And real people complicate narratives. I used to think love meant staying, enduring, forgiving over and over, no matter the cost. But I've learned that sometimes love means leaving, especially when the cost of staying is yourself. There's no dramatic end to this story. No reconciliation, no moment where they finally understand and apologize and we all hug it out. This isn't that kind of story. This is the story of what happens when you stop pretending, when you refuse to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm, when you choose honesty over harmony. And the truth is, it's lonely sometimes, but it's a different kind of lonely than the loneliness I felt sitting at that dinner table, surrounded by family, completely unseen. This loneliness is clean, honest. It's the loneliness of being yourself in a world that wanted you to be someone else. And I'll take that over the alternative any day. I think about that dinner sometimes. The moment I stopped pretending. The moment everything changed. My mother's face going white. My father locking the doors. The cold, calculated silence that followed. And I realize that wasn't the moment I lost my family. That was the moment I stopped losing myself. Because pretending had been costing me something essential. Something I didn't even realize I was giving up until I stopped. My voice, my truth, my right to exist as a full, complicated, real human being. I'd been trading those things for the illusion of belonging, for the fantasy of a family that never actually existed. And when I stopped trading, when I stopped pretending, everything fell apart. But maybe it needed to fall apart. Maybe some structures are so fundamentally flawed that the only honest thing to do is let them collapse. I won't pretend I don't have regrets. I do. I regret that I didn't understand what was happening sooner. That I spent so many years internalizing their assessment of me. That I allowed myself to be gaslit into believing my perceptions were wrong. But I don't regret leaving. I don't regret choosing truth over peace. I don't regret finally putting myself first. Because here's what I know now, what took me 33 years to learn. You can't reason with people who are invested in misunderstanding you. You can't fix relationships where honesty is punished and silence is rewarded. You can't set yourself on fire to keep people warm when they won't even acknowledge you're burning. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the healthiest thing you can do is walk away. Not because you're giving up on them, but because you're refusing to give up on yourself. There's a version of this story where I'm the villain, where I'm the ungrateful son who abandoned his family over nothing, who was too sensitive, too proud, too unwilling to forgive. That's the version they're probably telling. The version where they're the victims of my cruelty. And I've made peace with that. Because I know the truth. I lived it. I carried it for 28 years. And I finally put it down. So here's what I'd say to anyone reading this who sees themselves in my story. You're not crazy. You're not too sensitive. You're not making it up. If your family requires you to be smaller, quieter, less yourself to be acceptable, that's not love. That's control. If speaking honestly feels like betrayal, the system is broken, not you. If you're constantly apologizing for having normal human needs and reactions, the problem isn't your needs. It's their inability or unwillingness to meet them. And if you've spent your whole life trying to earn something that should have been freely given, it's okay to stop trying. It doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you a person who finally chose themselves. And that's not selfish. That's survival. I don't know where my family is now, what they're doing, whether they ever think about me. I assume they've rewritten the story, made peace with my absence by blaming my character, told themselves and others that they did everything they could. But I was just too difficult, too damaged, too unwilling to meet them halfway. And maybe that's easier for them than the alternative, which is admitting that they failed me, that they made me feel unwanted in the one place I should have been unconditionally accepted. But their story isn't my responsibility anymore. My responsibility is to myself, to the life I'm building, to the person I'm becoming now that I'm not constantly contorting myself to fit into spaces that were never designed for me. And that person? They're doing okay. Better than okay, actually. They're learning what it feels like to be valued for who they are, not who they pretend to be. They're building relationships based on mutual respect and genuine connection. They're discovering that being too much for the wrong people just means you're exactly right for the right ones. They're healing, slowly, imperfectly, but healing. And that's enough. I'll never have the family I wanted, the one where I was seen and valued and loved without conditions. But I have something else. I have myself. The whole, complicated, too much and not enough self that I'd spent decades trying to minimize and manage and apologize for. And I'm learning to love that person, to defend them, to believe them when they say something hurt. I'm becoming the parent to myself that I never had, the sibling who shows up, the friend who doesn't flinch away from uncomfortable truths. And maybe that's not the fairy tale ending. Maybe it's not the reconciliation story people want to hear, but it's real. And it's mine. And after a lifetime of pretending, real feels like freedom. So if you're reading this and wondering whether it's okay to walk away, whether you're overreacting, being too harsh, giving up too easily, let me tell you, trust yourself. You know what happened. You were there. You felt it. And if pretending everything is fine is making you feel like you're dying inside, then maybe fine isn't worth it. Maybe the truth, your truth, is worth more than their comfort. Maybe you're worth more than their comfort. You are. I promise you are. What if the problem had never been you?